if you just stop and look closely at the last few decades, it's hard not to feel like the established rules of the world have kind of broken. Whether you point to something huge like the 2008 financial crisis, or the environmental stuff that's accelerating, or even just this feeling, this growing sense that nation-states just can't handle global problems anymore. Something fundamentally shifted.
It absolutely did. And that right there is the mission for this book review. We're not looking at a bunch of isolated crises. We're trying to get at the multidimensional structural change that ties all of them together. And we'll be using this foundational concept of the network society pioneered by Manuel Castells to really grasp the core logic of this new economic, cultural, and social world.
Right? So our sources are tracking trends that they were already visible in the late 20th century, and they all point to a new structure that's defined entirely by networks. And this isn't just about being connected, this is something else. It's powered by digital tech that allows for, almost endless expansion and change, right? It breaks past the old physical limits.
Exactly. And right at the beginning, we have to clear up a really crucial distinction here, a conceptual difference that really separates this era from everything that came before. The author is insistent that we are entering the informational society, not just the information society.
Okay, but that sounds a little bit like splitting hairs, doesn't it? Information. We've always relied on information. The printing press was an information revolution.
Of course, and that's the key objection. But think of it this way. It's the difference between a society that uses industry and an industrial society. Where the industrial form it permeates everything. Information has always been critical, sure, but informational means that the actual generation, processing, and transmission of information, those things are now the fundamental, the decisive sources of productivity and power. It's because of the new tech lets us handle complexity at a scale and speed that was just unimaginable before. Information becomes the raw material.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's get into the technological foundation. Then the sources bring up that old debate, does technology shape society or does society shape technology? They say it's a false dilemma.
It is. It really is. Technology doesn't determine society, but society doesn't just write a script for technology either. The way to think about it is that information technology is the fabric. It's the fabric in which all human activity is now woven. And the core transformation we're talking about is all about the technologies of, information processing and communication.
So what were the threads that came together to create this new fabric back in the 70s? Well, the IT revolution wasn't just one single invention, it was a whole set of technologies converging. You had microelectronics, computing both the machines and the software, telecommunications, broadcasting, optoelectronics. But the thing that often surprises people is that the sources also include genetic engineering in that list.
Genetic engineering that seems like it's coming out of left field. That's biology, not computing. How does that fit in?
It fits because it operates on the exact same core principle as digital tech, the decoding, the manipulating, and the reprogramming of information codes. In this case, it's the information codes of living matter. The logic is that once you can treat life itself as an informational system, its manipulation starts to converge with the tools and logic of computing. It's revolutionary.
That connection is critical. Wow. So let's look at where this all came from. The IT paradigm really emerged in the US, especially California, in the 1970s. But the process itself was deeply paradoxical. It seems like it needed two totally conflicting forces to even happen, right?
The paradox is fascinating. It's this marriage between the military-industrial complex and the counterculture. So on one side, you have the massive, decisive role of military funding. Agencies like DARPA, projects like ARPANET, they were essential. They funded the early electronics industry and built that initial backbone for scientific cooperation, all under the Department of Defense.
The huge top-down structure. And it completely opposite to that. You have the grassroots, the culture of freedom of individual innovation that grew out of the 60s campuses, often explicitly rejecting all that military and corporate hierarchy.
And you needed both. You absolutely needed both. ARPANET was supposed to be for military and scientific work, but the scientists on it immediately started using it for their own personal emails and research. They just co-opted it. That tension kind of became official in 1983 when ARPANET actually split. Milnet became the strictly military side and ARPANET was left for the civilian scientists.
But the really human element, the grassroots part, came from things like the modem for PCs. I mean, we forget how important these little inventions were. Two students in Chicago, Christensen and Suze, they invented the modem in 1978, and it was just because they wanted to send programs to each other without having to drive across Chicago in the winter.
It's an incredibly relatable motivation, isn't it? And driving world-changing tech. And their next decision was just as important. They developed the protocol X modem, and then they diffused the technology for free. Their whole purpose was to spread communication as widely as possible, to let people outside of the elite universities connect. That single act was really the seed of the whole open source ethos.
So you've got military necessity creating the highway and this bottom-up, almost libertarian counterculture creating the cars for everyone to drive on it. It's a tension that's still there today, really.
And it all led to the eventual privatization of the whole thing. ARPANET was shut down in 1990, and the last piece of government operation, the NSF Net, closed in April 1995. That was the moment the internet was fully handed over to private commercial interests, and that just accelerated everything.
Okay, let's pivot now to the global economy that this network supports. The source has defined it with 3 words: informational, global, and networked. We've talked about informational. What does it mean for the economy to be truly global and networked?
Right. It's global, not because every little village is trading on a global scale, but because it's strategic core activities. So production, consumption, capital, technology, all of that is organized on a planetary scale, or at least through linkages that span the planet.
And networked.
That just means productivity and competition happen mostly in global networks between businesses, not inside these huge old-school national corporations. Think of global supply chains, or business alliances that are constantly reconfiguring. It's all about flexibility over fixed hierarchy.
And the clearest, and you could argue the most dangerous example of this, is the virtualization of capital. The globalization of finance is really the true backbone of this whole economy, and it was driven by 4 key factors. Can you walk us through those?
Sure, the first 2 are pretty straightforward. Commuter networks made a single global financial market possible. And then deregulation in the 80s just removed all the old national controls on money flows. But the last 2, that's where the system got really fragile and opaque, which brings us to securitization.
Securitization, right? It's the process of bundling up assets like mortgage, car loans, whatever, and then repackaging them as a security you can trade. This totally transformed finance because it meant the financial valuation of these incredibly complex synthetic assets became the paramount standard for everything. It moves the risk around the global network.
And the fourth factor, these exotic financial products like derivatives and credit default swaps, that's what really baked the risk into the system. For our listeners who hear these terms all the time, what do they actually do?
Well, a derivative is just a contract whose values derive from something else, like a stock index or, a big bundle of mortgage debt. A credit default swap, ACDs, that's just a type of insurance against a default. The problem wasn't the tools themselves. It was that they let the financial sector create nominal value exponentially out of capital, completely eliminating transparency and just inflating a bubble far beyond the real economy.
So capital gets detached from reality, just trading seconds for money. This is what the source is called timeless time.
Exactly. Time literally creates money. Transactions are instant, and with things like futures and options, you're capturing future time in the present. Capital just absorbs linear time. It's this relentless acceleration where the speed of the transaction is everything.
What's so fascinating and frankly frustrating is the irony of how this all happened politically. This wasn't some outside force. It was politically induced by governments themselves.
Oh, the irony is profound. You think of Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s, and then the Clinton administration in the 90s. Nation-states were, and I'm quoting here, among the most active agents of globalization, as they tried to ride the tiger for their own benefit. They thought they could harness it.
But in engineering the triumph of global markets, they basically cut their own legs out from under them. They reduced their own ability to control these global flows of wealth.
And the logic becomes irreversible once capital can move instantly. And globally, a single government can't just reimpose controls without risking total capital flight and economic catastrophe. They built a beast they can no longer tame.
But this shift is so massive. And yet we hit the productivity paradox. The IT revolution is taking off from the 70s onward, but the highest productivity growth was actually between 1950 and 1973, the age of old-school industrialism. How is that possible?
It is the ultimate head-scratcher for economists. There are a few leading hypotheses. One is just the time lag. It's like the electrical engine. It was invented in the 1880s but didn't really revolutionize factory productivity until 1920s. The tech gets adopted fast, but the full systemic impact takes decades of social restructuring.
And the second reason is measurement, right? The move to services.
Precisely how do you measure productivity gains in a vague services sector? How do you quantify the increased output of a journalist using the internet or a manager firing off 300 emails? It's not like counting widgets off an assembly line. The old metrics are useless.
And the third hurdle, maybe the most important, is cultural.
Yes, the underlying culture and institutions, our companies, our schools, our bureaucracies, they all have to undergo fundamental change before they can really translate this new technology into observable gains. We had the tools, but we hadn't learned how to fundamentally reorganize our work around them yet.
Okay, let's move from productivity to people. How is this new logic changed work itself? Because even though the total number of jobs has gone up, partly because more women entered paid work, the shape of a job is almost unrecognizable.
Well, the standard job has basically vanished if you define a standard worker in the old sense. So male, full-time, long tenure, the sole earner for the household, that slice of the workforce dwindles. To get this, a mere 8% in major developed countries.
Oh, wow. That's practically nothing. It means the entire societal model of a stable long-term job that underpins pensions and family life, it's just evaporating.
Yeah, it speaks to the massive rise of flexibility. The network enterprise needs an adaptable labor force. It wants short-term contracts, temporary roles, part-time work. It gives firms agility, sure, but it creates widespread insecurity for workers.
And yet not every country went down the exact same path. The Japanese example from the 90s is really interesting.
Here it is. Japan managed to keep a low unemployment rate and uphold its Chukikyo, its long-term employment system for its core workers, even during a major recession. It shows there are diverse paths to the informational paradigm. Japan's institutions could mediate those global pressures to get a different outcome for labor.
Finally, we have to talk about the transformation of geography itself, space of flows versus the space of places.
This is maybe the most fundamental change of all. The space of flows is the material organization of all these practices that rely on networks, not on physical closeness. It's where capital moves, where information circulates. It's where power and wealth now live.
And the space of places,
that's where we live our daily lives, our culture, where being physically next to someone still matters. The logic of the network society is about the domination of the space of flows over the meaning and dynamics of every local place.
So this totally reframes how we think about big cities. It's not that London or New York are global cities in their entirety. The network only reshapes certain parts of them.
Exactly. The sources argue that global networks find and restructure specific nodes within those cities. The financial district, the tech cluster for a point that is on the network, distance is 0. But for any part of that city outside the network, an old suburb, a disconnected neighborhood, the distance is effectively infinite. They're cut off.
And the ultimate example of this is the relationship between Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta in China.
It's the perfect case study. Hong Kong's old manufacturing base, it vanished. It got replaced by high-level services, but the manufacturing capacity didn't disappear. It just got restructured across the border in China. Hong Kong industrialists set up thousands of factories in the Delta,
And the scale is just mind-boggling. By the mid-90s, they were coordinating the daily activity of something like 6,000 workers from their offices in Hong Kong.
that entire gigantic industrial system physically in another country was functionally managed as a single entity through the network. The high-value control stayed in the Hong Kong node while the actual production was dispersed. That is the space of flows in action.
So after this whole scrutinization, what does this all mean for you, the listener? We basically identified a core structural schizophrenia. You have this dominant tendency where power and wealth are accelerating into an ahistorical network space of flows.
And this flow-based structure is trying to impose its logic of speed and flexibility onto our scattered, segmented places, the places where we actually find meaning in community. And since these dominant social practices, from finance to biotech, are organized in networks that basically annihilate linear time, we risk living in two completely different realities.
So the ultimate challenge isn't just economic or political, it's existential. If our meaning and culture stay local, rooted in physical space and live time, but all the power and wealth are global and defined by timeless speed, how do you bridge that gap?
The provocative thought is this: you have to actively build cultural, political, and physical bridges between that relentless, accelerating math, the structure that governs everything, and the meaningful, bounded reality of your local place and your personal time. Because the alternative is that you risk having the places you cherish become completely irrelevant to the flows that actually determine their future. You end up living in parallel universes.